Defence Secretary, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Lots to get through, mainly on your area. Can we start with Israel and the ongoing situation in the Middle East? I'm sure you'll have seen overnight Benny Gantz, very, very senior figure in the Israeli War Cabinet, former Defence Secretary, has threatened to resign from the Netanyahu government because he's saying that Netanyahu does not have a plan, a credible plan, for the post-war situation in the Gaza Strip. I mean, is the British government satisfied there is any kind of plan?
Well, I'm very keen to see a plan developed, actually, and my opposite number, the current Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, said the same thing in the week, and I messaged him to say that's absolutely right. The world does need to know, Gaza needs to know, the Israeli population needs to know what is the plan for the day after. Because otherwise you're essentially in a battle here against Hamas terrorists, and we respect the fact that Israel has a right to defend itself and was brutally attacked, but you've got to have some hope for the future. You've got to know that Israel doesn't plan to remain there, and actually I think there's a wider plan which in the end could involve getting to normalization in terms of relations with other countries in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia, which could bring a greater peace to the region if the pieces can be put in place. So yes, of course, it's right to have a plan for afterwards, and we're keen to see that.
Has the British government asked for it? Asked the Israelis for it?
Throughout, actually, and in lots of different ways. So in my conversations, I frequently sort of said, what is the end game? How are you going to make sure that a form of government is established, which is a Palestinian government, but isn't Israel remaining in there, and does mean that people are not in Gaza represented by a bunch of terrorists and Hamas. So that's the challenge.
Have they given you, you say you've asked repeatedly, have they given you any answers?
Well, I think what we're seeing now is, in a sense, is some of that internal debate in Israel, which is, remember, unlike in the UK where governments typically are made up of a single party, it's not just a coalition like the one we had here when the Lib Dems were in coalition. This is a rainbow coalition, so it's extremely complicated.
But can I deduce, Defence Secretary, that they haven't given you an answer, because you say you've asked repeatedly for it. You say
well, of course,
to emerge now. They haven't given you an answer.
You'd know if there was a plan, and there isn't one that we've seen, and we think there should be.
Does that rather put into doubt, or rather call into question, our continued full-throated support for the Netanyahu government in terms of the British
Well, we've
government?
never just...
Because we're basically given them support, which has not been totally unqualified, but it's been pretty full-throated, and yet we don't have any clue on what the post-war situation is going to be, and we're 9 months in.
I just want to correct something there. Our support is not for the Netanyahu government, as you describe it. Our support is for a democratic state, the only one in the Middle East, who have a legitimate right to defend themselves from terrorists who came in and beheaded people, raped them, slaughtered them, kidnapped them, and murdered them.
But in practical
terms, that is very different.
On a day-to-day basis,
well,
that manifests itself in terms of support for the Netanyahu government. I just wonder if you're disturbed by the fact that there doesn't seem to be a plan.
No, I disagree with that. We have very robust conversations where we are very clear on our expectations to ensure that, for example, international humanitarian law is met, that Gaza is, as we suggested to them, and they did use the language for a bit, flooded with aid, and we've seen the United Kingdom's part in ensuring that pier has been driven into Gaza, providing the aid, Britain helping to sort the aid from Cyprus, providing some of it, having the command and control ship RAFA Cardigan Bay in the Mediterranean, and being a big part of providing that. So again, you've said it twice now, and it's not. Our job is not to support the particular government. Our job is about understanding the difference between a democracy that has been attacked and a terrorist organisation who isn't good for their own people or obviously for the region or Israel.
I want to move on to something else, which is, I've just returned from Georgia. You'll of course be aware of the protests that have been taking place there. How concerned are you by what is happening in Georgia, and in particular the question around Russian influence as to what is going on right now?
Extremely. This law that they're trying to pass is not democratic. It's to do with restricting media. It looks like it's under the influence of Putin and Russia. And it reminds us that there is a genuine world battle about the worldview that we think that at this moment in time is absolutely existential to all of our futures. It's one thing for Russia or China or other areas to have autocratic leaders who don't give the public a say, and we don't like it, but in the end it's their internal business. It's completely different when they try to impose that world order on others, and that is a bit of what we're seeing there in Georgia. Georgia's future is towards Europe as a democratic nation, looking towards NATO and European institutions. It's not. And it's not, I think. Yeah, I mean, looking west. It's not, I think, to the sort of despotism we see come from Putin, who slaughters his political opponents.
I interviewed the leader of the opposition there yesterday, who wants the West, including the UK, to sanction the Prime Minister if he goes ahead with this law, and his billionaire backer, the owner effectively of his party, Inishvili, and the coterie around him. Is that something that you would consider?
Well, it's certainly concerning what's happening there. I don't want to comment on the specifics of that. I haven't gone into the detail there, but I do think that just the future for which actually is a very good future, I think, for a country like Georgia, is to embrace the kind of liberal freedoms that we have in the West, and not to get fooled into taking away power from citizens, which is what all of these things do. And ultimately, we see what happens. You end up in a situation where anyone who wants freedom, like Navalny in Russia, is murdered by the president.
I must ask you about the infected blood scandal, but before we do, just on foreign affairs, just on Ukraine briefly, how confident are you that the Ukrainians are going to be able to repel the attack on Kharkiv that we're seeing right now?
I think they will, ultimately. But I think it's been a massive mistake to have blinked, have taken our eyes off the ball. And I actually went to Ukraine, to Kyiv, earlier this year, and warned that the gap in providing aid was creating a situation where it was quite likely that we would be in a position where some of what we're seeing now with these towns and cities, smaller ones, being taken, ended up being the upshot. So I think that Ukraine can recover this. I think that they likely will recover it. But I also think that we have a collective responsibility to do what the United Kingdom's done throughout, which is to ensure that we continue to give on a regular basis. One of the reasons why the United Kingdom's not only increased the amount of money we're giving, but we've also said that we'll continue to do that every year, to give President Zelensky and the Ukrainians the confidence that when it comes to Britain, you have a rock-solid ally, which is why they consider us as their greatest supporter.
Turning to the infected blood scandal, it looks like the Chancellor is going to have a major announcement on this in terms of the compensation. I mean, you've had the recommendation from Sir Brian Langstaff, who has, of course, been heading up the inquiry since July 2022, that the victims and their families should be paid, quotes, without delay. We're nearly 2 years on from that now. Why haven't you acted before now?
Well, I know that this report that will be published tomorrow will, I hope, bring a very significant moment to this absolute scandal of infected blood. In fact, my first contact in terms of constituency casework with this was actually just a couple of weeks ago, when a couple came to me who'd lost their son decades ago, and they showed me the photographs of him. The fact that it's taken decades and decades to get to this point is, of course, absolutely wrong. A big sort of, I'm not sure, well, he'll tell us more, whether it's a cover-up, whether it's a no one quite wanting to give answers, or computer says no attitude, but for whatever reason, this has taken far, far too long. I don't want to preempt. In fact, I don't know what the Chancellor will say, so I have to leave it to that. But I mean,
but one way or the other,
my heart goes out to them.
Of course, and I'm sure they'll appreciate that. But one way or the other, you talk about it taking decades, and of course, there are big systemic questions for the whole British government and many British governments, not just yours.
No, it's gone back so far.
Absolutely, but your government has had the recommendation from Sir Brian Langstaff since July 2022. He said, and as you know, this was of particular importance because there is someone dying as a result of this scandal once every 4 days. So it would have been good, wouldn't it, if you had simply obeyed that instruction or accepted that instruction 2 years ago, and then roughly 150 people who have died since then would have received compensation before now. So I ask you again, why didn't you do it back in July 2022 when you had the recommendation from him?
Well, as I say, I'm not. My entire contact with this has been as a constituency MP,
Sure, I
actually. And
appreciate that. Yeah.
one of the things which might be, which is interesting about this, is was asking them, are there other constituents in Welwyn, Hatfield? I've not been contacted about this before, and they said no, we don't think there are. And I suspect all of this has taken quite a long time to come to a head because cases are spread across the country. You asked specifically why after that report. Well, I know that there was further work commissioned, and that's the report that we'll see tomorrow. I don't have the detail to provide for you. I've not been. Health Secretary is one of the very few jobs I've not had,
Well,
so
never
I'm just
too
not
late.
close enough to that detail, I'm afraid.
Why do you think it is? We seem to have so many of these scandals, don't we, within the British state of late? Do you think one of the problems, in particular with this one, and some of the details are hair-raising, talking about, doctors conducting experiments on children, all these sorts of things, is one of our problems that we perhaps venerate the NHS too much as an institution, that we think it's sometimes rather above criticism or inquiry?
Yeah, I mean, you say we've had a lot of late. Remember, this is something which goes back decades.
Sure,
I mean,
you don't want to be the post office scandal, others and so on.
And I rather hope that the answer to that is, and take the post office scandal as well, also goes back a long way. I rather hope that the answer is that we are just a lot better at uncovering things. Not we, I mean the nation, the society, and perhaps because of the ability for anyone to speak these days on social media and those types of things, perhaps we're just better at investigating and uncovering these things than we would have been in decades gone by. I also think we have a much better view of what real justice is these days compared with the years gone by, and things which were, oh, never mind, nothing we can do about it. Well, that's not acceptable in today's society. So I suspect there's quite a few societal changes that have led to this finally coming to a head.
Your colleague and former Chancellor of the Exchequer, albeit briefly, Nadhim Zahawi, has told the Sunday Times that he thinks it was a mistake to get rid of Boris Johnson. Do you agree with that?
Well, I was saying it at the time, so I said that 2 years ago. I supported him.
So you agree
right
it was
the
a
way,
mistake? You still think
right
it was a
the way
mistake?
through. Well, I mean, I'm not. You can't go and relitigate what's already happened. But I said it at the time, so it doesn't.
So logically, therefore, you think it would be better if Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister?
Well, it's not what I'm saying now because so much time has passed in between. I simply make
yes.
the point that at
you
the
haven't
time
changed your mind.
I wasn't saying that that he should be chased out. Not because, by the way, he was never he's clearly had many flaws, but I also thought he did some things extremely well, particularly getting that vaccine before other countries.
So you haven't changed your mind, Defence Secretary, about Boris
Well,
Johnson?
as I say, I think it's impossible to sort of go from what I said 2 years ago, which is very clearly to say I think that we shouldn't
even
be
though Rishi Sunak is
this.
doing such a good job as Prime Minister.
Well, I think, by the way, I think Rishi has done extraordinary work under very, very difficult circumstances. Because if you think about it,
Boris would have done it better.
Well, you're forgetting about what happened in between. There was another change.
Yes, indeed.
I think that I think that Rishi actually has done an extraordinary job under very difficult circumstances, including dealing with the thing we were just talking about. To get back to serious things, Ukraine, the price spikes that came through the energy costs from Putin, and who's managed to get that under control. And what government? Well, that's been Rishi's work, and many other things. What's happened in Northern Ireland?
Sure.
Sourcing that situation.
Well, talking about
Rishi's
Northern Ireland,
work.
just
So
finally,
I think he's done a great job.
Just talking about Northern Ireland, since you mentioned it, Defence Secretary, just finally, Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris, you'll have seen today, MP for Daventry, has said that he's going to be standing down at the next election. It's rather a flood, isn't it? What would you say to your colleagues, all of these people deciding to step down? You're sticking around, I assume.
I am indeed, absolutely.
Well, there's a relief.
Look, people serve in government and in public service. He's done nearly a quarter of a century, because I think he was an MEP when we were in Europe.
There are a lot of them,
before he became an MP.
There are a lot of them, an unusual number. It does rather suggest that your colleagues aren't too confident about the future.
No, I don't think it's actually statistically true. You always get more from the governing side because you have a lot more MPs, for one thing, and there may be vagaries of the fact that when people got elected, but 25 years, you don't think I should?
No, I'm just saying there's a lot more than the last election. I mean, there's a lot. You can't seriously think, Defence Secretary, that there aren't a lot of MPs deciding to call it a day.
Well, as I say, actually, interestingly, and I have taken the time to look at the figures in a bit more detail, on average, at the end of a full 5 years, remember the last Parliament was only 2 years, so of course you're going to have more after a full 5-year Parliament. So that's different for one thing. But
anyway, you would say
it's not particularly unusual.
Would you say your colleagues stick
It's
around because the future is going to be great?
Yeah, I'd say it's an overwritten story, and I think that anyone who thinks that the election is in the bag, and the person who thinks that most, of course, is Keir Starmer, is taking the public for granted and taking everyone for fools. We have a democracy, an election to get through first.
Defence Secretary, so grateful for your time. Thank you.